Hi everyone, this is Diana, your host for today, and welcome to another episode of Modernization Accepted, a podcast by Resolute Software. If you like what we're doing, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Today, we'll be talking to Mark Troester, VP of Strategy at Progress, and Veli Pehlivanov, CTO here at Resolute. We will be diving into the topic of infrastructure management, and I cannot be happier to be in a virtual room with such professionals. So, welcome, Mark and Veli, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Hello, Didi.
Thanks, Diana. It's great to be here.
Okay, I suggest we dive right in. You both bring a very unique perspective on infrastructure management, and given the rapid technological change, a lot of organizations are pressured to deliver a wide variety of applications that would connect directly to the user. The thing is that usually it's the applications that get all the spotlight, but what lies behind it is also quite crucial. So, can you talk more about how essential the infrastructure layer is to supporting those applications and how to manage the complexity? Mark?
Oh, thanks for the question. Yeah, I think it's a really great question because, I think all of us experience applications that are really effective and that we really like. But then we might have an application that maybe is running slow or maybe it's not available or, some other problem, or you're worried about potentially, the security of the application, whether your data is going to be trusted. At some level, while the application is the front end of what people see, there's vast infrastructure that sits behind these applications. It's multi-layered. It can be on different clouds. And so if you don't have solid infrastructure, then your applications are just not going to be successful.
Yeah, absolutely agree with Mark. And the demand for infrastructure is not getting any smaller, right? It's actually increasing. And it's primarily due to two reasons, in my opinion. First, the complexity of the business applications increase, which means that application infrastructure is getting more and more complex itself too. And then there is the increased demand for more of that infrastructure to support the businesses, which now uses more applications than before, where the mobile workforce is more mobile, accessing the systems from anywhere, which provides an extreme challenge for application maintainers and for infrastructure providers to keep up with all the trends that the modern business user is demanding.
Yeah, I agree with you. And we've mentioned complexity so many times for just a couple of minutes. IT teams are under pressure to keep up with fast deployment timelines with increasing demand. Do you have any recommendations, practices, strategies to tackle this?
I think there's, there's a lot that people can do. And I think a lot of it really comes back to automation. And I think it's also kind of looking at the topology of the infrastructure. Veli talked about how complex it can be, because if you think about, devices, you've got devices strewn across the world, you've got clouds, different clouds, on-premise infrastructure, and then you've got multiple levels. You have to make sure that the network is reliable. You have to make sure that you can have the right visibility or observability into all of your different assets, whether it's a server, a storage device, switches, firewalls, all these different things need to come together and be managed in a cohesive fashion. So I think, looking at it holistically, thinking about what your entire infrastructure topology is in terms of what things you need, whether it's not just around DevOps, right? It's DevSecOps, but it's not just that. It's the ability to observe and monitor. It's the ability to remediate. It's the ability to balance your application across multiple assets in a secure fashion. And then it's, watching for security, both kind of north, south, and then anything that's going east, west in terms of, across, a certain infrastructure layer.
Yeah, absolutely. I think automation is front and center to basically all IT infrastructure management strategies, because what used to take a few small engineering steps is now a complex workflow of activities that involves multiple engineers, specialists, different business stakeholders, often involves third parties in terms of infrastructure vendors, cloud services, SaaS products. So it's a complex environment that needs to be managed consistently and with with predictable outputs every time, which means that the complexity of execution is increasing and is absolutely demands the automation of the biggest number of activities in this workflow to make sure that they always happen the same way, right? It shouldn't be. Businesses should essentially eliminate the variety of activities or the freedom of execution, and hence the freedom of the output result of those activities when talking about automation. We strive for consistency. We strive for really unblocking as many of those executions as possible, so the frequency of execution, so that businesses enable more rapid updates and ultimately faster change in those systems. These are all front and center to the idea of automation. And of course, there's also some non-technical benefits that we get for us in terms of the consulting practice around this field. It's really about the dissemination and sharing of knowledge in the organization. Infrastructure management is typically the specialty of few select specialists in organizations that kind of become something like a silo in terms of the knowledge and the experience they have with the different aspects of the automation of infrastructure. We want to disseminate this knowledge to as many people in the organization as possible, hence automating most of the steps so that there is a knowledge base and there's a set of prescriptive rules on how to execute on those objectives. And also the exposure of automation is now bigger than ever. What used to be provisioning of, let's say, a database and an application server and then some end user applications maybe, is now a bunch of different tasks, right? So we have provisioning and configuration, we have software updates, patch management, we have backup and recovery, disaster management and disaster recovery plans, performance monitoring and alerting. All those are now subject to the same automation activities that previously used to be only about provisioning your application. So the automation surface is much bigger than before, and hence much more critical even than before to get right.
Okay, if we take a step back and take a look at the bigger picture, take a look at the whole software development process, what comes after production and deployment? It surely is not a one-off task. How do organizations ensure that they have effective monitoring, maintenance to avoid straying from the initial state? Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I think you touched on a couple things, in terms of the entire dev, test, prod lifecycle or whatever. Maybe there's some other steps in there as well. It's really being able to back to automation, and Veli brought this up, right? I mean, the only way we can have success and we can navigate through that different lifecycle is through automation. And I think this gets into a lot of different things, not only automating being able to push releases, but to support and push everything else that needs to support that application release. And then I think it's, then it's looking at, and we'll talk about this later in terms of security, but then that's bringing security in so that you're not only making sure that your production deployment meets your standards, but you start by testing that it meets its standards in the previous iterations of the life cycle. So I think that's how I think about the life cycle and importance in terms of DevOps and being able to not only, manage and automate that, but to have visibility across the different layers as well.
And yeah, definitely. To me, the initial production deployment is really a step zero or a phase zero of the entire project of automation and infrastructure management, because there's a whole bunch of activities now that become front and center for the efficient execution on that strategy. And Mark correctly mentioned some of the most critical ones: security and patch management, for example. If we only take the subtopic of managing security for your business applications, now opens up a whole different field of SecOps, DevSecOps type of activities, tools, and technologies that you need to adopt. And if you have not thought about those early on when you were initially thinking about the first production deployment, the objectives were different, right? We get that. But now it's a whole completely different sea of objectives and technologies that you need to get right. So this is why I think that a production deployment used to be really the holy grail of successful infrastructure management or the successful provisioning of infrastructure. But now it's really the first step in a long journey with new discoveries, new objectives, new set of technologies that you face every day. And this also makes infrastructure management technologies, automation, and the efficient strategies of deploying those much more critical than before.
Yeah. And where does talent sit in the whole situation? How important it is, the flexibility and elasticity of the DevOps expertise?
Talent, of course, is really the foundation of it all, right? Because you need staff that is prepared to face those challenges, not necessarily prepared to solve all of those in the beginning, right? This is typically not a solvable objective from the get-go. And a lot of businesses think about automation strategies, infrastructure management strategies, security and patch management once it's really a burning problem for them, which is fine, right? We absolutely get that businesses focus on what's important today. But to us, it's about having the resources to efficiently execute on that, both human resources and also technological resources and capabilities to execute on that. And also there's the aspect, again, of information, of knowledge, and really not the individual professional knowledge, but the organizational knowledge that you need to create. If you think about some historical data on this field, what used to be a single developer or database engineer maybe provisioning their database, some deployment somewhere on a web server, is now a whole set of activities with their own specialists, with specialties like SecOps, DevSecOps, pure operations, or incident management and response. All those fields now converge as pieces of a successful infrastructure management strategy that really starts with the talent and with the preparedness of your professionals to face those challenges and solve them accurately.
Yeah, and I think the role of tools can really help with the staff too, because Veli's right. I mean, we all know we need, key human resources, but what we can do to augment those key human resources is in a number of ways, and it does go back to automation. And, I think a good approach is really being able to drive policies through the automation as well. And so if you get this right, and it takes a lot of work, you can have a relatively small staff manage a massive infrastructure in terms of multi-cloud through the right approach of automation. And we touched on this too, but it's not really just automating the initial configuration, but it's automating the compliance aspects of it. It's automating, that there has been no drift, and if that happens, to do things through remediation. And it's, managing kind of day-to-day operations and knowing that you have to be able to do something, but then it's being able to react to, something that you didn't expect. Maybe you detected some type of issue with security and you want to be able to automate the response to that. And you want to be able to orchestrate that to be able to say, hey, if I have a complex environment, I need to roll out these changes in a methodical fashion so that maybe I can maintain a quorum so that I still have uptime while I'm actually doing these changes. So there's just a lot that can be done to help the humans get that work done and to free them up to do other things. And so, also I think getting back to automation is it can also help you kind of do self-service. So you have a team of DevOps that's supporting multiple application teams, or they're working and collaborating with a large security organization. That DevOps team can provide kind of building blocks where some of it can be self-service automated so that they can, really grow their ability to support the organization.
Absolutely agree with Mark here, and I think he focuses on something, to me at least, very important, is because while you enable the self-service approach for a lot of those business applications that you want more agility from, you want professionals to be able to spin them up on their own, to get going efficiently, quickly, get the job done faster. You at the same time need to keep an eye on the goals and the objectives that are relevant to your infrastructure strategy, on your standards, right? And infrastructure automation, policy management, as Mark mentioned, becomes extremely important at that point, where you need to be able to replicate the same outcomes of infrastructure management and provisioning, but with consistent results every time, regardless of who is doing what, regardless of who needs to provision what type of application. So you need to allow for variation, at the same time sticking to the same standards for quality, for data governance, for security, for the consistent execution on the same technical checklists, if you want, for observing policies and making sure that there is no expansion of boundaries beyond what is necessary, beyond what is regulated or commissioned. And at this point especially, I believe infrastructure automation and management technologies particularly come into play, because it's not just about knowing how to do that, but it's about also enabling everyone in the organization that need to do that to be able to execute without being a DevSecOps specialist themselves, right?
It seems like this role has substantially evolved over time, but can you tell that there is any shortages of talent, and how do you normally tackle such an issue?
Yeah, certainly. We generally see a shortage of talent in the infrastructure management specialty or industry in general, simply because of the sheer pace at which technologies develop, that maybe keeps track with the increase in demand, but certainly the availability of knowledge and talent is not able to catch up with that. So organizations typically find themselves, and very frequently this is just all of a sudden type of event, in need of very serious infrastructure management capability by way of adopting, let's say, a cutting-edge business application platform, or by way of having progressed with their own business applications developed in-house, but very often find themselves unable to execute on the equally increased infrastructure management challenges. And this is where we see that the availability of talent, and not just availability, but the on-demand access to that talent becomes critical, because it's not typically a discipline that a lot of organizations plan for in the early stages. Like if you are a 5-person or 50-person organization, chances are you're not thinking about your DevSecOps team, right? But what happens when all of a sudden you have a 10x increase in your business? Now you need a much more, you have a much increased demand for business applications. Maybe you're provisioning 10 different additional types of applications, but they all come with the same data security, governance, access control requirements as the little small 2 applications that you used to work with before, right? So the increase for infrastructure management talent, I would say, is not linear over time for organizations. It's peaking. It's peak-based. And it's important for businesses to be able to respond to this increase by the ability of sourcing just-in-time talent that is relevant for the objectives of the specific business and project.
Mark, what's your observation on that?
I mean, since my life is, I completely agree with everything that Veli said. I think that the majority of my career has really been focused in working at software vendor companies, and most of that has been working with tools and platforms that help developers, infrastructure, IT people, DevOps get things done more effectively. And so we take, what we try to do is we try to produce, software that is amazingly easy to use, that makes the developers and other people around the developer ecosystem more productive, so that we can help them be productive, right? So that, it's not about it's kind of taking the human out of where they don't need to be, so that you can expand the ability for them to get things done. And so, by doing things like having a platform that allows you to manage your entire ecosystem with one approach is the type of example that we do there. And so it's really all about, what can we do to help the developers be more productive, help IT infrastructure operations people more productive. And now, that what we're looking at and using a lot of as we move forward is, how can AI help? How can we assist an IT ops person to build the policies that they need to make sure that they are in compliance with any regulatory requirements. So it's really, that's, to me, that's where my interest has been, is how can we help those developers get more skilled, and how can we help them be more productive through platforming software and tools.
Yeah, and I like Mark's notion of getting the human out of the way, right? Or making the human either more productive or not necessary in involvement, right? I think the whole idea of the automation strategies, of the monitoring, automatic response, alerting, and really this is where also AI comes in with the ability to analyze huge volumes of data much quicker than a real human. It's really, it becomes front and center to minimize the manual activities for the human, to the point where only the humans that understand what's going on at the high level and are able to interact with the policy configurations maybe, or who intrinsically know what's important for the business, come to really assist the system do its job. I think we're slowly getting to a state of increased adoption of automation technology in this field, and really high-level consulting and engineering impact or specialist impact for activities that are now policy-specific or organization-specific rather than technology-specific. That latter part is slowly taken out of the picture through the means of modern technology, including AI.
So this role is not only evolving over time, but it's getting more and more sophisticated, mentioning consultancy rather than just the operational technological part.
Certainly so. I think the infrastructure management field in general is much more transforming into a type of specialist consultant type of activity for engineers, because now nobody's thinking about writing their next Python script. Probably Mark would be able to go in much deeper detail here, but the idea of automation management with automation tools and deployment tools working in sync is about understanding what the end snapshot of your topology of your whole infrastructure is, the ability to reason about that and what's the impact of that infrastructure to your business, and not the little nitty-gritty technical details on how to get there.
And you both mentioned security several times throughout the conversation. Veli even mentioned very briefly how important it is to be included in the beginning. Can you elaborate how critical it's for organizations to include security and compliance in the very beginning of the product development?
Absolutely. It's more critical than ever. And the impact of misconfigured, weak security applications is probably the most negatively impacting type of infrastructure for the business. Recent security statistics show that it's not about whether or if it's going to happen, it's about when exactly. So, it's really some specialists are depicting a very gloomy picture about it's inevitable, right? Well, it is inevitable, maybe, but still, this doesn't mean that we can do nothing about it. And basic security is now table stake requirements for any organization. And there are certain practices that you need to adopt, that you must adopt, automate as much as possible to make sure that you are at least covered at the basic level. At the same time, we see an increased demand for more care around data governance, data management, locality of data, regulated business domains that have very specific directions of how you manage and interact with your data, including internally in your organization. So those security aspects are absolutely non-negotiable for most businesses. It's not a question of whether I should spend resource on doing this. It's a question of this is now a basic requirement of my ops team. Ops teams are intrinsically becoming SecOps, just by definition of security being now front and center to any kind of provisioning requirements for the business.
And Mark, I'm sure you have a lot to say on that topic.
Yeah, so security aspects is certainly important, and it's kind of back to, some type of layered security approach, because you're not going to be like Veli said, I mean, there's the production aspect of it, but now we see a lot of attacks that are going into the software development lifecycle. So you need to not only secure your production environments, but you need to make sure that nothing gets dropped in or gets changed within the life cycle. And so it's really looking at what you have across your environment. It's being able to protect each layer. And so, if you think about maybe a starting point is if you have applications and applications are starting to grow, then you might start scaling that application infrastructure with a load balancer. And that's where you can start introducing, things like a web application firewall within that load balancer. But then as you grow, you need to be able to also detect what's happening at each different asset level. So you want to be able to observe what's happening there. And then you start layering, application servers, web servers, database servers. You've got other systems that you're integrating into. You need to manage things like an identity provider. You've got storage, and now you've got Kubernetes. So being able to manage that entire stack is going to require kind of a layered approach that allows you to not only kind of have, a walled infrastructure where you need to, but in many cases you can't do that. So you want to be able to start looking at what's happening at the network level. Because really, what packets are packets and they need to be analyzed. And that's where you need to be able to have a capability that allows you to detect, whether there's issues with application performance or whether there's some type of attack that's being applied to what's happening. And you can detect that, by looking at what's happening with those packets flowing through there. And then it's using kind of back to the software development lifecycle. It's thinking about, how do you bring security and compliance into this? And we kind of talked about policy. I don't know that we've introduced infrastructure as code yet or policy as code, but it's coming up with a common way that allows your developers to actually take what's being told to them by the compliance and security people and actually use that to manage their infrastructure. So not only are they using, infrastructure as code, which you can put a UX and UI on top of that to make it easy to actually develop and manage, but then you're applying that just as you're managing any other asset within your organization. So it's really a combination, holistic view of the world with the right tools and platforms in place to support collaboration so that you can have all of these different functions working more seamlessly.
Yeah, certainly so. And I like how you, Mark, tied the security aspect of the application components that are being deployed. It's almost like it's a feature of your application, right? It's absolutely non-negotiable to the point where it's now a major requirement for a complete production-grade application. And you're absolutely right about the increased exposure of potential security risks just by way of the increased complexity of your application. I remember the good old days where you had to just provision a database server and maybe a web application service somewhere, right? And as you mentioned, all of these are now transforming into multiple databases, multiple applications. Maybe you have a microservice environment. Maybe you have a highly available replica of your system multiple times, right? You have API gateways. Authentication services was a very good example. Very often the major attack vector for any kind of security threats. Content delivery networks is also something that we see being attacked very often. And then you have third-party apps, social login maybe, social network, and also the networking conditions themselves, right? So as Mark elaborated, the sheer complexity of being able to tie security metrics around that is getting crazy. It's quickly getting out of hand because now all of a sudden I have 20 different components that are a potential security risk to not only my business application, but also to my entire network infrastructure that I absolutely cannot miss monitoring and responding to in the case of any potential security threats.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting for people to think more expansively about the role of automation. And I know we've talked a lot about automation, but I think it's a really interesting aspect because I think a lot of us think of DevOps about, well, how do I configure my environment, right? But if you're creative about this, you can use a DevOps approach that has automation that allows you to do things like migrating from one cloud to another or repatriating workloads back to on-premise. And, there's a lot of different business reasons that we may need to do that. We work with organizations that come in and do an acquisition and they want to try to, consolidate or in some cases they want to have protection and not be consolidated on a single vendor. So there's a lot of different business reasons to have that. And automation can kind of help you do that. It can help you do this. Like if you're managing things with the right DevOps platform, you can almost point your automation from one cloud to another and help with those migrations or updates and things like that. It can also provide, that degree of technology independence where you don't want to be completely, invested in one vendor or one cloud. It gives you the ability to have some leverage, quite frankly, in terms of costs and other business reasons. And, I think too, we think about, another area is thinking about compliance audits and, how that can be kind of a roadblock to many organizations because it may stop, the release of an application. It may, slow down what's happening in terms of the software development lifecycle. So again, automation can help that if you're doing continuous compliance and you have the right infrastructure, you can push a button and actually create an audit that will pass or create a report that will help you pass that audit. So I think it's, thinking very creatively about how you can use your infrastructure to support many different business or technology initiatives.
I believe we've covered so many aspects about infrastructure management, and we cannot skip also one of the most important ones, the cost. Managing the cost of infrastructure can be a major challenge, especially with all those different layers of expenses associated with the traditional setup. Can you talk about any recommendations as to how to optimize the costs and also ensure or improve, depending on the scenario, financial predictability?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start. I mean, I like to think of kind of how can you optimize the cost or benefit at each level of the organization, right? So what can you do to support people and make them more effective? What can you do to support, maybe, newbies within an organization, and so that you can kind of bring somebody along in terms of how you train them, how you support them with services or with outside organization help. And then, how to build their career over time. And so I think that's one level. And then I think you need to think about how can you reduce the cost of your infrastructure or maybe your compute. And that's just using it more effectively. It's managing it very effectively. It's understanding maybe what your cloud costs are, and maybe if you need to shift some of your resources to another cloud or bring them on premise and then it's those are a couple of important things. And then it's kind of looking at what you can do to be, reduce your cost in terms of each aspect of the software development lifecycle. What can you do to make those developers more productive? What can you do to make IT operations more productive? And same with security. So I think that's it. It's looking at each step within the organization and making it as efficient as possible, so that you can bring that cost down across the entire topology and infrastructure and people and processes.
Yeah, and I totally agree with Mark here. I think the concept of cost needs to transition from the cost of provisioning the business application, whether that's through off-the-shelf purchase of software or it's through in-house development or outsourced development. But that type of cost only typically takes the threshold or stops at the threshold of production deployment. And the majority of the infrastructure or the majority of costs that poor infrastructure and poor infrastructure management incurs is beyond that point. So I think when talking about infrastructure management cost, we need to assess the total lifetime cost of a system that also does not make a compromise on a set of standards that we need to establish for efficient infrastructure. Those are performance standards, security standards. Those are automation standards, for example, with things like configuration policy and the componentization of infrastructure management components, as Mark mentioned a few minutes ago, the ability to enable other users to take a self-service approach to your infrastructure provisioning goals. Those are the business standards that need to be established against which cost is assessed. Because it's very easy to think about infrastructure cost as an unplanned cost or something that goes out of pocket quickly, simply because you did not think about the objectives of efficient infrastructure management by the time you were provisioning or planning for the provisioning of a business application. That mindset, I believe, needs to change and transition from really the cost of acquiring a piece of software or generally a digital enabler for the business, we can say. It could be software, it could be hardware, it could be access to some cloud infrastructure, as Mark mentioned. And the total cost of that needs to include any long-term cost of successful management of the infrastructure for that piece of system. And modern technology has progressed to a stage where a lot of the human cost can be offset with technology, which is intrinsically much more cost efficient than having staff do the manual work. And I think, as Mark mentioned, some of those aspects of technology enabler that infrastructure management solutions provide is absolutely necessary versus the alternative of having someone on payroll execute them on a daily basis. It's almost a no-brainer, right? And then beyond that, I believe there's also the cost of high-level skill and high-level understanding, professional understanding of the needs, the opportunities in the technology market, and the ability to bridge those two and have an efficient infrastructure management strategy deployed in your organization. That high-level skill is also a piece of the cost that businesses need to plan for, and also probably something that you could minimize with efficient mixture of technology, insight, and also active collaboration with different stakeholders from the business. That's how we think about really the total cost of a project. From a professional service perspective, when we talk about infrastructure management project, we always think about the long-term cost of efficient infrastructure being more of a function of the right adoption of technology and the cost for that technology versus the long-term cost of manual labor, which is probably going to be higher in the beginning, but should, as a best practice rule, phase out into minimum amounts given the overall infrastructure efficiency and the cost of maintaining technology there.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, we've talked a lot since we've focused a little bit more on the DevOps piece, how we all understand how automation can help you kind of run and automate and update things, but it's also using technology in ways that helps other people within the process. So it's being able to analyze the data that we have and apply, machine learning or AI to help someone who's trying to detect a threat. So instead of spending, maybe days or weeks to actually analyze and determine what is causing a potential issue, it's being able to do it, it's being able to do it very quickly. It's being able to use all of that data that you have in terms of how you're managing the infrastructure, what's being changed, what's the status of everything, what's happening in terms of your network flow, traffic, and things like that, as being able to, apply advanced analytics to that information to help us do predictive work that would, again, make the human more productive and reduce costs. So if you can find something that's wrong early in the process, it's going to be cheaper to fix. So there's just many different elements about, how to use technology in creative ways across the entire software development lifecycle, across every different person within the organization. So think about technology, very expansively, and how you can use it to kind of help, reduce amount of time it takes to do something, which reduces cost. And it also, helps you get things into production faster, which is what you're trying to do in terms of driving business success.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. It's in a way that the cost structure of a successful business project or software project for the business is changing from labor-intensive to technology-intensive aspects.
Since we are heading towards the end of our conversation, I would love to really, really thank you for a very, very insightful conversation. It was a pleasure. Thanks for joining me. And to those watching and listening, don't forget to like and subscribe and stay tuned for more.